If one more step is taken, there will be no turning back. The words didn't come from a speaker or a soldier. They came from the man standing alone at the edge of the forest, where the last line of human steel met the first breath of ancient wilderness. And Dr. Clara Hayes felt them before she even saw him, like a pressure behind her ribs, like the air itself was warning her to stop. 50 yards ahead, the drilling platform groaned as its reinforced bit pushed deeper into the ground. Gauges flickering, red lights blinking across metal panels as technicians shouted measurements in feet and pressure levels, none of them realizing the earth beneath them wasn't just resisting. It was reacting. Clara's tablet trembled in her hands, data spiking in patterns that didn't make sense, energy readings pulsing like a heartbeat. And for a second she forgot the soldiers, the orders, the mission, because this wasn't science anymore. This was something older, something alive. Then the forest shifted, not with wind but with presence, and he stepped forward. Cale Thornridge, the Alpha King, his dark coat barely moving as if the world itself bent around him. Silver eyes fixed on the machines tearing into land that was never meant to be touched, and behind him, shadows gathered, dozens at first, then hundreds, figures emerging between the trees with silent precision, every movement controlled. Every gaze locked on the line of humans who suddenly felt far too exposed in the open clearing. Clara swallowed, forcing herself to breathe as she stepped past the nearest soldier, ignoring the hand that tried to pull her back, because she knew this moment, this exact moment, was the fracture point her father had tried to prevent, the one hidden in every note he left behind, every warning buried between lines of research no one else had taken seriously. Cale, she called, her voice steadier than she felt, carrying across the distance like it didn't belong to her. And for a heartbeat, everything stilled, the machines, the voices, even the forest itself, as his gaze shifted to her, sharp, searching, dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with violence and everything to do with truth. You need to stop them, she said, taking another step forward, boots sinking slightly into the cold dirt as the ground vibrated beneath her feet. This isn't what you think. It's not an attack. But the words felt thin the moment they left her mouth, because the soldiers behind her raised their weapons just slightly, not enough to fire, just enough to say they were ready, and the wolves behind him mirrored the motion in a way no human could replicate. Instinct lining up with instinct, tension coiling tight between two worlds that had promised never to meet like this again. Cale didn't move, didn't blink. His voice when it came low enough that she almost didn't hear it. You brought them here. And it wasn't an accusation shouted in anger. It was worse, quieter, heavier, like something breaking beneath the surface. Clara shook her head, gripping the tablet harder as another spike tore across the screen, numbers jumping beyond safe thresholds. No, someone wanted this, she whispered, more to herself than to him. But he heard it. She knew he did, because something in his expression shifted, just slightly, just enough to reveal that he had felt it too, that something inside the forest, inside his own territory, wasn't right. And then, somewhere behind the human line, a single sound cracked through the tension. Not loud, not explosive, but sharp enough to shatter the fragile stillness. And in that instant, Clara understood with absolute clarity that whatever line had once separated peace from war had just disappeared. The sound did not echo like a weapon or a machine. It was smaller than that, sharper, like something snapping deep inside the balance both sides had been clinging to. And Clara felt it travel through her chest before she understood what had actually happened. No one moved at first, not the soldiers behind her, not the wolves in the trees, not even Cale, but the stillness was different now, fragile in a way that could not be repaired. And somewhere to her left a console began to beep in rapid succession, warning lights flashing as the drilling platform suddenly powered down without command. Its systems overridden by something no one had programmed. What was that? A voice called from the human line, tense, uncertain, and Clara turned just enough to see confusion spreading faster than fear, technicians staring at screens that no longer obeyed them, numbers climbing beyond any expected threshold. And she knew then that whatever signal she had detected before was no longer hidden. It was active, pushing through every system, every sensor, every boundary that had once separated their worlds. She stepped forward again, ignoring the way the air seemed heavier now, like it resisted her movement. "Kale, listen to me," she said, forcing her voice steady even as her pulse raced. "This is not your people, and it is not mine. Something is triggering both sides." But the words barely settled before a ripple moved through the wolves behind him, subtle but unmistakable, heads turning toward a single point deeper in the forest, as if they had all heard the same silent command. Kale's gaze shifted for only a fraction of a second, but Clara saw it, the calculation, the recognition, and beneath it something far more dangerous, doubt, not in her, but in what stood behind him. "Stand down," he ordered without raising his voice. Yet the authority in it cut through the tension like a blade, several wolves hesitating, holding their positions, but not all of them, because one figure stepped forward from the shadows, slower than the rest, deliberate, confident in a way that did not match the moment. And Clara felt her breath catch as the energy readings on her tablet spiked again, locking onto that movement, as if the source of everything had just revealed itself. "You waited too long," the Alpha said, his tone almost calm, almost amused, and the way the wolves around him shifted made it clear he was not just another voice in the pack. He was influence, pressure, something that had been building long before today. Clara's mind raced, pulling together fragments of data, patterns she had dismissed, inconsistencies in the signals she thought were interference, and now they aligned with terrifying clarity. "It is him," she whispered, more certain than she wanted to be. "He is the source," and Kale's eyes snapped back to hers, the connection between them tightening in an instant, no longer just tension but understanding, the kind that comes too late to stop what has already begun. Behind her, a soldier took a step forward, then another, reacting to the shift in the wolves rather than any direct threat, and that was all it took, because movement became meaning, and meaning became intent. And Clara felt the moment slipping out of her control as both sides adjusted, bracing, preparing, not for what was true, but for what they believed was about to happen. "Do not do this," she said, louder now, her voice cutting through the noise, through the fear, through the rising hum of something ancient beneath their feet. But the Alpha in the shadows only smiled faintly, as if this had always been the plan, as if every step, every signal, every misunderstanding had led to this exact point. And Clara realized with a cold certainty that the war was not starting because of a single action. It was starting because someone had made sure it could not be stopped. The ground did not shake like an earthquake. It pulsed, slow and deliberate, like something beneath the surface was waking up after a long and unwilling sleep. And Clara felt it through the soles of her boots, through her spine, through the steady rhythm of her heartbeat that no longer felt entirely her own. The tablet in her hands flickered, then steadied, then surged again with a pattern so precise it could not be random. A signal layered beneath the natural energy of the land, something engineered to provoke, to amplify, to push both sides past hesitation and into reaction. "It is driving them," she said under her breath, eyes locked on the data as it mapped directly to the Alpha standing in the shadows. Every spike aligning with his presence like he was not just part of the system but controlling it. Kale took one step forward, and the forest seemed to lean with him, tension tightening across the invisible line that separated wolf from human, instinct from logic, and for a moment Clara thought he might actually stop it, that he might still pull everything back from the edge, but then the other Alpha lifted his chin slightly, just enough to shift the balance again. Just enough to remind everyone watching that control was no longer absolute. "You feel it, do not you?" the Alpha said, his voice carrying without effort, calm in a way that did not match the chaos building around them, the land choosing its side. And several wolves shifted subtly behind him, not attacking, not advancing, but aligning, drawn not by command but by something deeper, something that bypassed reason entirely. Clara's breath caught as the readings surged again, higher this time, pushing into levels she had only seen once before in her father's archived files, the ones marked with warnings he never explained. And suddenly, it was no longer just about stopping a confrontation. It was about preventing a chain reaction that neither side understood. "Kale, this is not natural," she called, stepping closer to the boundary despite the raised voices behind her, despite the tension that snapped like a wire stretched too tight. He is using the core, amplifying instinct, making it feel like truth. And for the first time since she had seen him, Kale's expression shifted fully. Not anger, not doubt, but recognition, the kind that comes when something unspoken finally has a name. The alpha in the shadows smiled at that, faint but unmistakable, as if that realization was part of the design, as if understanding it changed nothing, and maybe it did not, because the moment had already moved beyond explanation. Behind Clara, boots shifted against dirt, a line tightening, weapons lowering just enough to signal readiness rather than restraint. And she knew those movements were not orders, they were reactions, each one feeding into the next, exactly as intended. You cannot stop this, the alpha continued, his gaze sliding between Kale and Clara like he was measuring them against something larger. It has already begun, and the words settled into the air with a weight that made Clara's chest tighten, because he was not threatening them. He was stating a fact. Kale's jaw tightened, his voice low, controlled. Stand down, he repeated. But this time it was different, not just a command, but a test, a line drawn not just for his pack, but for himself, and for a fraction of a second it worked, the wolves holding, the tension pausing on the edge of breaking, until the signal surged again, stronger, deeper, pulling at instinct like gravity, and Clara saw it in their eyes, the shift from choice to compulsion. Kale, she said, softer now, closer, because distance no longer mattered. If you give in to this, it is exactly what he wants. And the space between them felt impossibly thin despite the yards of ground that still separated them, because in that moment it was not about sides anymore. It was about a single decision that would decide everything. And then, somewhere along the line, someone moved too fast, not out of aggression but fear, and that was all it took, because fear, once triggered, spreads faster than reason, and Clara realized with a sinking certainty that whatever chance they had to stop this was slipping away with every second they hesitated. Do not move, Clara said. But the words felt too small against what was already unfolding, too fragile to hold back something that had been building long before any of them stepped onto this ground. And she saw it happen not as a single action, but as a chain, a soldier tightening his grip, a wolf shifting his stance, a breath held too long, and then released at the wrong moment. The space between the two sides compressed, not physically but emotionally, like pressure building in a sealed chamber, and the hum beneath the earth grew louder, no longer subtle, no longer ignorable, vibrating through bone and instinct alike. Clara forced herself forward another step, closing the distance inch by inch. Her focus locked on Kale because he was the only one who could still change the direction of what came next. This is not your instinct, she said, her voice cutting through the rising noise. It is being forced on you. And she saw it land, saw the flicker in his eyes as something inside him pushed back against the pull. But it was not just him anymore. It was all of them. And the more they resisted, the harder the unseen force pressed down. Behind Kale, the alpha in the shadows tilted his head slightly, almost curious, almost patient, as if he had expected this resistance and accounted for it. And Clara's tablet surged again, the readings peaking and sharp, rhythmic spikes that matched the subtle shifts in the wolf's posture, their breathing, their focus narrowing as if guided by something they could not see. You feel it as truth, Clara continued, her voice softer now, but no less urgent. But it is not yours, and for a fraction of a second, the forest seemed to listen, the tension pausing just long enough for doubt to exist, and in that fragile space, Kale took another step forward, placing himself directly on the boundary line, neither side nor the other, a living line between two worlds that no longer trusted each other. Enough, he said, and the word carried weight, not just authority but intent, a refusal to be moved by anything other than his own will. And for a heartbeat it held, the wolves behind him steadying, the soldiers behind Clara hesitating, the entire scene balanced on a knife edge. Then the signal surged again, stronger, sharper, and Clara felt it this time not just as data, but as pressure inside her mind, like a whisper she could not quite hear, but could not ignore, urging movement, urging reaction, urging the collapse of restraint. Someone behind her took a step forward too quickly, reacting to the shift rather than the truth, and that single motion rippled outward, mirrored unconsciously by the wolves across from them. Not an attack. Not yet, but close. Enough that the difference no longer mattered. Stop, Clara said again, louder now. Almost pleading, because she could see it slipping, see the moment unraveling thread by thread. And Kale's gaze snapped back to hers, sharp, focused, holding on to something that was rapidly being pulled away. The Alpha in the shadows smiled then, not wide, not obvious, just enough to confirm what Clara already knew, that this had never been about one action or one mistake. It had been about creating a moment where no one could tell the difference between choice and manipulation. The ground pulsed again, stronger this time, and the machines behind Clara flickered back to life for a split second before shutting down completely, as if the land itself had decided to take control. And in that instant of flickering light and rising tension, Clara understood that they were no longer deciding whether war would happen. They were deciding how it would begin, and whether anyone would be left who remembered it. Was never supposed to start at all. The air changed first, not in temperature but in weight, pressing down on Clara's chest until every breath felt measured, deliberate, like the world itself was waiting for something to happen, and she realized with a quiet dread that it already had. The signal was no longer rising. It had stabilized, locking into place like a switch that could not be turned off, and the patterns on her screen flattened into a steady, relentless rhythm that matched the pulse beneath her feet, beneath the machines, beneath the forest itself. It is locked, she whispered, more to herself than anyone else, because this was no longer escalation. This was activation. Kale did not move, but everything around him did. The wolves behind him shifting in unison now, no longer hesitating, no longer questioning, their focus narrowing into something sharper, something less like instinct, and more like direction. And Clara felt a cold clarity settle in her mind as she understood the difference. Instinct was chaotic, unpredictable, but this was controlled, guided, shaped into a single outcome. He is not pushing them, she said, her voice tightening as she stepped forward again, ignoring the warning calls behind her. He is aligning them. And the words hung in the space between her and Kale, heavy with implication, because alignment meant intent, and intent meant this was never about reaction. It was about design. Kale's eyes darkened, the gold within them dimming slightly as something deeper took hold, not loss of control, but the strain of holding on to it. And Clara saw the moment it cost him, the effort it took to remain himself while everything around him tried to pull him in another direction. You said this land chooses, Kale said slowly, his voice cutting through the tension with quiet force, his gaze shifting past Clara to the Alpha in the shadows. But it does not choose you. And for the first time, something in the other Alpha's expression flickered, not doubt, not fear, but irritation, subtle and brief, gone almost before it could be noticed, but Clara caught it, and that was enough to confirm what she already suspected. It is not the land, she said quickly, her thoughts racing ahead of her words. It is the interface. The core responds to presence, to dominance, to patterns it recognizes, and he is feeding it exactly what it needs to. Amplify. And the realization hit her fully now, sharp and undeniable. This was not just manipulation, it was synchronization. The Alpha in the shadows had found a way to use the core as a conduit, turning natural instinct into something directed, something that could override hesitation and make it feel like certainty. Behind her, the human line tightened again, not advancing, not retreating, but bracing, reacting to the shift they could not understand. And Clara knew they were feeling it too. Not as instinct, but as unease, as pressure building without a clear source, pushing them closer to a reaction they would justify later as necessary. Kale, she said, her voice lower now, more urgent, because time was no longer something they had. If this continues, it will not matter who started it. The outcome will be the same. And the space between them felt impossibly thin again, not measured in feet but in decisions, in the fragile thread of trust that still existed despite everything pulling it apart. The Alpha in the shadows took one slow step forward, just one, but it was enough to shift the balance again, enough to draw the attention of both sides, and Clara felt the signal spike in response, not wildly, but precisely, like a conductor guiding an orchestra to its crescendo. You are trying to hold back a tide, he said calmly, his voice carrying with quiet certainty. But tides do not stop. And the words settled into the moment with a finality that made Clara's chest tighten, because he was right about one thing. Something had already been set in motion, something larger than any single command or plea. Cale's jaw tightened, his gaze flicking once more to Clara, and in that brief exchange, everything passed between them. The truth, the risk, the choice that had no safe outcome, and Clara knew then that whatever happened next would not just define the border, it would redefine everything that came after, because the line between war and peace had already been erased, and all that remained was how far it would spread. Then we break the tide, Clara said, and this time her voice did not shake, because something inside her had settled into place with the same certainty as the signal beneath their feet, a realization that came too late to prevent what was happening, but just in time to change how it ended. Cale's gaze locked onto hers, sharp and searching, as if weighing not just her words but the conviction behind them. And for a brief moment the noise around them faded, the tension, the shifting lines, the rising pressure, all of it narrowing down to a single exchange that neither side could see, but both would feel the consequences of. How? He asked, not as a challenge, but as a demand for truth, and Clara tightened her grip on the tablet, turning it slightly so he could see the data, the patterns, the steady pulse that no longer spiked because it no longer needed to. He is using the core as a feedback loop, she said quickly, her thoughts aligning with the data in real time. It amplifies what it receives: dominance, fear, reaction, and sends it back stronger, creating the illusion that it is instinct, but it is not. It is a loop, and loops can be broken. And she saw it again, that flicker of understanding in Cale's eyes. Not just recognition, but strategy forming beneath the surface. Behind him, the wolves shifted again, closer now to action than restraint, their movements no longer hesitant but coordinated in a way that made Clara's chest tighten, because every second they waited, the loop reinforced itself, pulling them deeper into something that would soon feel irreversible. You would have me turn away from my own, Cale said quietly, not looking away from her, and Clara shook her head immediately, stepping closer despite the invisible line that still separated them. No, I am asking you to trust that what you feel is not entirely yours, she replied, her voice steady but urgent. If you follow it now, you are not leading them, you are following him. And the words landed hard, heavier than anything she had said before, because they cut to the core of what he was, what he had built, what he was trying to protect. The Alpha in the shadows took another step, slower this time, deliberate, and the signal responded instantly, a subtle increase that Clara felt more than saw, like pressure building behind her eyes, and she knew he could sense the shift in Cale, could feel control slipping just enough to become dangerous. You speak as if control still exists, the Alpha said, his tone calm, almost patient, but you are already within it, and Clara's heart pounded, not from fear but from urgency, because he was not wrong about the system, only about the outcome, and that difference was everything. Cale, she said, softer now but more intense, because this was the moment, the one that would decide whether the loop held or broke. The core responds to the strongest signal, not the first, not the loudest, the strongest, and right now, that is him, she said, her eyes flicking briefly toward the Alpha before returning to Cale. But strength is not force, it is will, and if you push back, if you anchor your pack to you instead of the signal, you can disrupt it. And the words hung there, fragile and powerful at the same time, because they asked for something that could not be measured, could not be guaranteed. Cale inhaled slowly, the movement, subtle but deliberate. And for a second Clara thought she felt the shift even before it happened, like the air itself responded to his decision, and behind him, a few wolves stilled, just slightly, just enough to suggest that the loop was not absolute. The Alpha in the shadows noticed it too, his expression tightening for the first time, the faintest crack in his control, and the signal surged in response, not smooth now, but jagged, unstable, as if compensating for something it had not accounted for. Clara's pulse raced as she realized what that meant. It is working, she whispered, not daring to raise her voice, not daring to break the fragile change taking place, because this was no longer about stopping the war outright. It was about reclaiming even a fraction of control before everything collapsed completely. And in that narrow space between influence and choice, between signal and will. Clara saw something she had not seen since this began, a possibility, small and fragile, but real, that the outcome was not yet fully decided. Cale closed his eyes for less than a second, but when he opened them again, something had shifted, not in the world, but in him, and Clara felt it like a change in gravity, subtle but undeniable, as if the center of everything had just moved. The pressure in the air did not disappear, the signal did not vanish, but it hesitated, fractured in a way it had not before, its steady rhythm breaking into uneven pulses that no longer felt absolute. Behind him, the wolves reacted instantly, not all of them, not yet, but enough, their stances adjusting, their focus flickering between the unseen force pulling at them and the man standing at their center, and Clara's breath caught, because this was what she had meant, not stopping the signal, but disrupting its hold. Hold, Cale said, and the word carried differently now, not just command but anchor, something solid in a moment that had become dangerously fluid. And for the first time since the signal locked into place, several wolves stepped back instead of forward, a small movement, almost invisible, but powerful in its defiance. The alpha in the shadows did not move immediately, but his gaze sharpened, the calm certainty in his expression thinning just enough to reveal something else beneath it, calculation shifting into urgency, because the system he had built depended on momentum, on inevitability, and Cale had just introduced doubt into something that was not designed to accommodate it. Clara glanced at her tablet, her hands steady despite the tension surrounding her, and the data confirmed what she was feeling. The loop was no longer clean, the amplification breaking into irregular spikes that no longer aligned perfectly with the wolves' movements. The synchronization slipping, not gone, but weakened. "You are losing it," she said, quietly, not to provoke but to state what was already happening, and the alpha's attention snapped to her, his faint smile returning, but this time it did not reach his eyes. "Temporary," he replied, his voice still calm but edged now with something sharper. "Correction is inevitable." And as if to prove it, the signal surged again, harder, more aggressive, pushing against the disruption Cale had created, trying to force the system back into alignment. Clara felt it hit like a wave, not physical, but internal, a pressure that made her thoughts blur for a fraction of a second, and she saw the effect ripple through both sides, soldiers shifting uneasily, wolves tensing as instinct and influence collided again, and she realized with a jolt that the alpha was no longer maintaining control, he was forcing it. "He is overcompensating," she said quickly, turning back to Cale, her voice urgent but controlled. "The more he pushes, the more unstable it becomes." And Cale's jaw tightened, his focus sharpening as he absorbed that, not just as information but as opportunity. "Then we push back," he said, his voice low, steady, and the words carried weight not just for Clara but for every wolf behind him, because they were not a reaction, they were a decision, and Clara felt the shift again, stronger this time, as more wolves anchored to him, their movements slowing, their focus pulling away from the invisible force and back towards something real. The alpha's expression changed. Then, not subtly, not briefly, but fully, the calm facade cracking as irritation gave way to something closer to anger, not uncontrolled, but precise, directed, and the signal responded immediately, spiking higher than before, jagged and unstable, like a system being pushed beyond its intended limits. Clara's pulse raced as she watched the data climb into dangerous territory, patterns breaking down into chaos that no longer resembled the controlled loop from before, and she understood what that meant. This was no longer about control. It was about forcing an outcome before control could be lost entirely. "Cale," she said, her voice cutting through the rising tension. "If it collapses, it will not stop, it will cascade." And the word hung there, heavy with implication, because a cascade did not choose sides, it consumed everything. Cale did not look at her this time, his gaze fixed on the alpha in the shadows, the line between them no longer just physical but absolute. And for a moment Clara realized they were no longer standing at the edge of war, they were standing at the edge of something far less predictable, something that neither side could fully control once it began, and the only question left was who would break first, the system, or the people trapped inside it. "Then we do not let it collapse," Clara said, the words coming faster now, sharper, because hesitation was no longer an option and neither was waiting for the system to stabilize on its own. And she could see it clearly in the data. The core was no longer amplifying clean signals. It was fragmenting, breaking into competing frequencies that clashed instead of aligned. And that meant one thing. The system was losing coherence. Cale stood unmoving at the boundary, but the space around him felt different now, not just controlled but resisting, like a force pushing outward instead of being pulled in, and behind him more wolves steadied, their movements no longer synchronized with the erratic pulses, their focus returning piece by piece to something grounded, something real. You cannot hold them all, the Alpha in the shadows said, his voice no longer carrying that effortless calm, the edge in it sharper now, controlled but strained, as if he could feel the instability spreading through what he had built. The system will correct, and as if responding to his will, the signal surged again. But this time it did not stabilize, it fractured further, spikes colliding, overlapping, creating interference that Clara could feel not just in the tablet, but in her own thoughts, a pressure that no longer guided but disrupted. No, Clara said, stepping forward again, closer than she had been before. The line between sides now almost meaningless in the face of what was happening. It is not correcting, it is failing. And she turned the screen toward Cale, her voice steady despite the chaos rising around them. The feedback loop is breaking down. It cannot sustain opposing inputs. If you keep pushing back, it will destabilize completely. And Cale did not need to look at the data to understand. He could feel it. Clara knew he could. Because the shift in him was no longer subtle. It was deliberate, a conscious resistance that spread outward through the wolves behind him like a countercurrent. The Alpha's expression hardened. The faint smile gone now, replaced by something colder, more focused, and Clara realized he was no longer trying to maintain control. He was trying to force an outcome before control slipped away entirely. You think collapse will save you, he said, his gaze locking onto Clara with a sharp intensity that made the air between them feel charged. But collapse does not distinguish between sides. And Clara's chest tightened because she knew that was true. This was not a solution without consequence. It was a choice between controlled destruction and uncontrolled escalation. Behind her, the human line shifted again, voices rising, confusion turning into urgency as their systems continued to fail, their instruments no longer reliable, their commands delayed by fractions of a second that felt like minutes. And Clara knew they were close to reacting, not because they understood, but because they did not. Cale, she said, her voice lower now, focused, because this was the moment where everything narrowed down to a single decision. If it stabilizes again, he wins. If it collapses, we still have a chance to stop what comes after. And the words carried weight not just because of what they meant, but because of what they demanded, a willingness to let the system break in order to prevent something worse. Cale's gaze shifted to her then, fully, no hesitation, no doubt, just clarity. And in that instant Clara knew he had already decided, not because of her words alone, but because he could feel the same truth in the ground beneath them, in the air pressing against them, in the unnatural rhythm that no longer matched anything living. Hold your ground, he said, his voice cutting through the chaos with a force that did not rely on the signal. And this time the wolves responded not in unison, but in choice, each one anchoring themselves not to the invisible pressure but to him, and Clara felt it, a shift that was not driven by amplification but by will, by trust, by something the system could not replicate. The Alpha in the shadows stepped forward again, faster this time, the first movement that felt reactive instead of planned, and the signal spiked violently in response, not controlled, not precise, but chaotic, as if trying to compensate for something it could no longer manage. And Clara's tablet flashed with warnings that no longer made sense because the patterns they were built to detect had broken apart entirely. It is breaking, she whispered, the realization settling in fully now, not as fear, but as inevitability, and as the ground pulsed again, uneven, unstable, Clara understood that whatever came next would not follow the rules either side had prepared for. Because the system that had been controlling the moment was no longer in control at all. For a moment, everything held in a fragile balance that felt almost unreal, like the world itself was hesitating, unsure of which direction to fall, and Clara realized that silence could be just as dangerous as chaos, because it meant the next movement would decide everything. The signal beneath them no longer followed any pattern she could recognize, no rhythm, no structure, just bursts of unstable energy colliding and dissolving into something unpredictable, and the core was no longer amplifying intent. It was amplifying uncertainty. Cale stood at the boundary, unmoving, but the space around him had changed completely, no longer reacting to the signal but resisting it, holding against it. And behind him the wolves were no longer a single force, they were individuals again. Their stances varied, their focus no longer locked in one direction, but searching, questioning, choosing. The Alpha in the shadows saw it too, and this time there was no attempt to hide the shift in his expression, the calm certainty gone, replaced by something sharper, something that bordered on desperation, because the system he had relied on was no longer predictable, no longer controllable. "You think this is victory," he said, his voice cutting through the unstable air. "But you have only removed the structure." And Clara felt the truth in that, not as agreement, but as warning, because without the structure, what remained was raw, unfiltered reaction, and that could be just as dangerous. Behind her, the human line shifted again, but this time it was different, not a unified movement, but fragmented, uncertain, some stepping forward, others holding back, voices rising in confusion as their instruments failed completely, leaving them without guidance, without clarity, forced to rely on instinct they did not trust. Clara's grip tightened on the tablet, though the screen was now filled with static data that no longer meant anything. And she understood that the science she had relied on had reached its limit, that what came next would not be solved by numbers or patterns, but by decisions made in real time, without certainty. "Cale," she said, her voice steady despite the storm building around them. "This is the moment, not before, not after, now." And he turned to her, fully, his gaze clear in a way it had not been since the signal first surged, not because the pressure was gone, but because he had chosen not to follow it. The ground pulsed again, uneven and sharp, and for a second it felt like everything might fracture completely, like the boundary itself might disappear, and Clara saw it in both sides, the realization that there was no longer a clear line, no longer a defined enemy, only a situation that could spiral in any direction depending on the next action taken. The Alpha in the shadows took one final step forward, his presence still strong but no longer absolute, and Clara felt the shift as something broke, not in the ground, not in the air, but in the illusion of control he had held. And, for the first time, his voice carried something it had not before, urgency. "You cannot hold this together," he said, and Clara knew he was right, not because it was impossible, but because holding it together was no longer the goal. Cale inhaled slowly, then stepped forward, crossing the boundary fully for the first time, not as a challenge, not as an attack, but as a statement, a choice that rejected the division entirely. And the effect was immediate, not explosive, not dramatic, but profound, the tension shifting, the focus of both sides snapping to him, to the single action that redefined the moment. Clara felt her breath catch as she understood what he had done. He had not chosen war, and he had not chosen peace. He had chosen something harder, uncertainty with intent, and in doing so, he had forced both sides to confront the same question at the same time, not who to fight, but whether to fight at all. The unstable signal flickered one last time, then dropped into silence, not gone, but no longer driving anything. And in that sudden stillness, Clara realized that the war had not begun, but it had also not been prevented. It had simply been delayed, reshaped into something far more dangerous. Because now it would not be driven by manipulation, but by choice, and choices, once made, could not be undone.